Can we, can we take whatever your men don't finish? She whispered it like a confession, like a sin she hadn't meant to commit. Her hands were shaking. Her coat was too thin for the cold. And outside the glass door, two small children pressed their faces against the window. Hungry patient, trusting that their grandmother would figure something out. The room went silent. Every single Hell's Angels biker in that diner stopped chewing. And the man at the head of the table, 6'2", scarred legendary, slowly turned around. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started like most mornings did at Pearl's Diner, slow, dusty, and honest. Pearl's wasn't the kind of place you found on a travel app or recommended to out-of-towners looking for something Instagram-worthy. It sat on a 2-lane highway somewhere between Bakersfield and nowhere the kind of road that existed mostly because trucks needed a reason to keep going. The parking lot was cracked asphalt. The sign out front had been missing the letter A in diner for 3 years, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. The coffee was strong enough to offend people who'd never worked with their hands, and the pie, well, the pie was the reason regulars drove 40 minutes out of their way. Inside, it smelled like bacon grease and something close to belonging. Marlene, the head waitress who'd worked there since before she could legally drink, was restocking the sugar dispensers at the counter when she heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound. The highway noise, trucks downshifting, wind pushing through gaps in the building, and all of it seemed to hold its breath at once. She looked up. Through the front window, she counted them. 1, 5, 12, 20, more. Motorcycles. So many motorcycles that the vibration moved through the floor of the diner before the first one even pulled into the lot. They came in formation, not ragged, not loud for the sake of being loud, but measured. Disciplined, like a military convoy that had traded uniforms for leather. Marlene set down the sugar dispenser very, very carefully. "Oh, Lord," she said to no one in particular. The trucker at the corner booth, a heavy-set man named Dale who had been eating eggs and reading a folded newspaper for the past 20 minutes, looked up. He saw what she saw. He put down his fork. He did not pick it up again. The door opened. The first thing anyone noticed about Jack Hollis Mercer wasn't his size, though he was large enough that the door frame seemed to acknowledge him differently than it did other men. It wasn't the patches on his leather vest, though those told a story that anyone in the know would read carefully and with great respect. It wasn't even the scar that ran from his left ear to his jawline, pale and old, the kind of scar that spoke of a life lived at the intersection of consequence and survival. It was the quiet. The man moved through space like someone who had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of power. He didn't swagger. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked in, looked at the room once, slowly, completely, the way a man checks a perimeter, and then chose a table near the back. His men filed in behind him, 23 of them eventually. They filled booths and pulled chairs from empty tables without being told where to sit, without confusion, without the usual chaos of a large group arriving somewhere. They moved like they'd done this 1,000 times because they had. Marlene stood at the counter with a stack of menus and tried to remember how to walk. "You gonna take those to them or just hold them?" said a voice beside her. She turned. It was Jenny, the youngest waitress on shift, 19 years old, with no apparent understanding of fear. Jenny was already reaching for a coffee pot. "Jenny, wait. They're customers, Marlene." Jenny was already moving toward the tables. "Customers get coffee." Marlene watched her go, then exhaled through her nose, gathered herself, and followed. Hollis did not look up when the coffee was poured. He was looking at a spot on the table, not in distraction, but in the manner of a man who thinks better when his eyes have nothing to do. His second in command, a wiry man everyone called Rope, leaned across the table and said something low. Hollis nodded once. "What can I get for you all?" Marlene asked, her voice admirably steady. Hollis looked up then. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter sky, and they were completely calm. Not the calm of someone trying to appear calm, the calm of someone who genuinely was. "Whatever's good," he said, "for everyone. Just bring it. We've got the breakfast special eggs, bacon, biscuits, hash." "Then bring that," he paused. "Coffee's fine." That was it. No performance, no intimidation. Just a man ordering breakfast for his crew, the same way a foreman orders for a work site. Marlene wrote it down and moved away quickly, not because she was frightened anymore, but because she didn't want him to see her hands shaking. She was almost back to the counter when she noticed the woman. She'd been there when Marlene arrived for her shift, hadn't ordered anything, had asked very politely for a glass of water, and Marlene had brought it without thinking much about it because sometimes people just needed to sit somewhere warm for a while. But now Marlene looked at her, really looked. The woman was older. Maybe early 70s, though hard living or grief could add years to a face in ways that had nothing to do with time. She was thin in the way that comes from going without, not from trying to. Her coat was a pale blue that had probably been lovely once, now faded and slightly too large, as if the woman inside it had shrunk without the coat knowing. Her hair was white blonde, pulled back neatly because whatever else had happened to this woman, she still cared about keeping herself together. She sat with her hands around her water glass and she stared at the table. Outside through the window just behind her, Marlene could see two children, a girl of maybe 8 and a boy a couple years younger. They were standing close together in the cold, the girl's arm around the boy's shoulders. Both of them watching the motorcycles with wide eyes that had probably forgotten for one moment that they were hungry. Marlene's chest did something complicated. She walked over. "Ma'am, can I get you something? We've got the breakfast special running." "No, thank you." The woman's voice was soft and precise, the voice of someone who had been taught to be gracious even when everything was wrong. "I'm fine, thank you." Marlene looked at the children outside. The girl was now pressing her hand flat against the glass, watching the bikers inside with an expression of pure awe. "Those your grandchildren?" The woman glanced back. Something passed across her face, love, exhaustion, a fierce, quiet pride. "They are. Emma and Tommy. They can come inside if they want. It's cold out." "We're fine." A pause. Softer. "We won't be long." Marlene wanted to push. She didn't. She went back to the counter, started loading plates, and tried to ignore the feeling sitting in the bottom of her stomach like a stone. The diner got loud in the way that large groups make loud, not aggressively, but with the cumulative noise of 23 men eating and talking and existing in a space. Plates came out, coffee got refilled, Rope made a joke that caused 4 men at his table to laugh loudly, and somewhere in the middle of it, Dale the trucker quietly paid his check and left. Hollis ate without conversation. He was the kind of man that people talked around rather than to, not out of fear, but out of a kind of instinctive recognition that his attention was something you didn't summon without reason. He was halfway through his eggs when he noticed the woman. Not immediately. He'd registered her earlier the way he registered everything as information filed and set aside, but now something pulled his focus back to her. Maybe it was the stillness of her. In a room that had become loud and alive, she was completely motionless, and stillness in Hollis's experience was almost always trying to tell you something. He watched her for a moment without appearing to watch. She wasn't eating, wasn't drinking, just sitting there with both hands wrapped around a glass of water that was no longer cold, staring at the table with an expression that Hollis recognized from a long time ago, from a different life, from a face he saw in mirrors during the worst years. It was the expression of someone calculating what they could afford and coming up short every time. Marlene came back out from the kitchen with another round of plates, and the woman said something to her. Marlene stopped. Marlene's face did something careful and kind, and she nodded and moved away. Hollis looked at Rope. What did she just ask her? Rope had been watching too. He was quiet for a second. Couldn't hear. Hollis stood up and walked to the counter. He didn't do it in a way that announced itself. He just moved there, picked up the coffee pot that Marlene had left sitting on the warmer, and poured himself a refill at the counter like a man in his own kitchen. And while he was standing there close enough to the woman now that he could have reached out and touched her shoulder, he heard Marlene come back out of the kitchen and lean down and say, "Honey, I can't promise anything. Whatever gets left over, I'll see what I can do." Hollis set down the coffee pot. He turned very slowly and looked at the woman at the counter. She was looking back at him. She hadn't meant to. He'd moved quietly and she'd suddenly realized someone was standing close, and now their eyes met, and she looked immediately down, color rising to her cheeks, her hands tightening around the glass. "Ma'am," Hollis said. The word was neither gentle nor harsh. It was just present the way he was present, fully and without performance. She didn't respond. Her jaw was tight. She was ashamed, and she hated being ashamed. He could see that clearly, the anger at herself, sitting just beneath the surface of the carefully composed expression. "What did you ask her?" Hollis said. The woman looked up. "I don't think that's your business." "Probably not," he agreed. A silence stretched between them. At the tables behind him, Hollis felt 23 men calibrate to something without anyone having to say a word. "I asked," the woman said finally quietly with the controlled devastation of someone setting down a very heavy thing, "if we could take whatever your men don't finish, the leftovers." She held his gaze now because she'd decided that if she was going to be humiliated, she was going to be humiliated with her eyes open. "My grandchildren are outside. They haven't—" She stopped, reorganized. "We'd be grateful for whatever's left." The diner was completely silent. Hollis said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then he turned to Marlene. "Bring 3 more breakfast special children's plates for the little ones." Marlene blinked. "They've got a kids menu." "Whatever they want, bring it." He looked back at the woman. "Call them in from the cold." The woman stared at him. "Sir, I can't. I'm not asking for—" "I know what you're asking for." His voice was steady as bedrock. "I'm not offering what you asked for. I'm offering something different." He pulled out the chair beside Eder, not for her, he was too practical for ceremony, but as a gesture. "Sit here. Your grandchildren can have the booth behind us. The food's already on its way." "I don't want charity." The word landed in the air between them. She'd said it with weight, with history, with the particular pride of someone who had spent a lifetime being self-sufficient and could not make peace with the fact that self-sufficiency had failed her. Hollis looked at her for a long moment. "Neither did I," he said simply, "when someone did this for me." Something shifted in her face. The armor didn't come down, not entirely, but something behind her eyes changed like a door unlocked from the inside. She stood. She went to the window and opened the front door, and the 2 children came in from the cold. Emma first, then Tommy, both of them with pink cheeks and wide eyes, and the careful, observant silence of children who had learned that adults were managing something they weren't fully allowed to understand. Emma looked at Hollis. Hollis looked at Emma. "That's your bike?" she asked, pointing out the window at his motorcycle. "It is," he said. "It's really loud," she said. "I know. Does it go fast?" "Fast enough." Emma considered this with great seriousness and then, apparently satisfied, climbed into the booth behind her grandmother without further ceremony. Tommy followed, watching Hollis the whole way with the particular reverence small boys develop for large men who do not seem to notice their own size. The food came, and for the next 20 minutes, Hollis Mercer sat at a diner counter in the middle of nowhere, California, ate the rest of his eggs, drank his coffee, and listened. He was very good at listening. It was perhaps his most underestimated skill, the ability to hear not just what people said, but what they said, around what they meant, the shape of the story that existed between the sentences. Marlene, who had by now completely abandoned her professional remove and was hovering in the area with the concern of someone who had decided she was involved in whatever this was, had brought over a piece of peach pie for both children unprompted. Tommy was eating it with the single-minded intensity of a child who could not believe his luck. Emma was eating more slowly, watching her grandmother. The woman's name was Evelyn Carter. Hollis got that from Marlene quietly while Evelyn was cutting Tommy's bacon. He got the rest of it in pieces. Some from Evelyn herself, who began to talk carefully at first, then with the unstoppable momentum of someone who has been holding something for too long and has finally found a place to set it down. Some from Marlene, who knew more than she should have, because that's the nature of a small community's diner, you hear things. Evelyn's husband, Richard Carter, had died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed in February, gone by October. He'd built something from nothing, a small auto repair shop that the community had loved, that had employed 4 people that had been, in Evelyn's words, his whole life after the kids grew up. The mortgage on their home had been manageable while Richard was alive. After he died, Evelyn had gone to the county loan office to restructure. That was where she met Victor Doss. "He seemed helpful," Evelyn said, and the bitterness in those 3 words could have stripped paint. "He told me he could consolidate everything, make the payments smaller. He had all this paperwork, and he explained it very carefully." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I trusted him. Richard always handled the finances. I should have brought someone with me. I should have—" She stopped again. "What happened?" Hollis asked. "He restructured the loan," she said, "except he didn't. What he actually did, what I found out 3 months later when I got a foreclosure notice, was transfer the deed, signed over to a holding company. I still don't fully understand the legal mechanism. My daughter tried to explain it. She looked down at her hands. We're supposed to be out by the end of the month. Hollis was quiet. The sheriff, Marlene said, appearing from behind the counter, with a coffee pot she didn't actually need to refill, is a friend of Doss's. Word is, they've done this before, more than once. She paused. 3 other families in the past 2 years, all elderly, all widowed or widowers, all properties that happen to be in areas the county's been looking to develop. The word develop sat in the air like a match held over gas. Hollis looked at Marlene. You know this, and nobody's done anything. Marlene set down the coffee pot with a small, tired sound. Who's going to do anything? The sheriff's in it. The county offices are connected. The newspaper ran one story and then stopped running his stories. She met his eyes. People around here have learned to look at the ground when certain things happen. Hollis turned back to Evelyn. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't expected. Not the desperate hope of someone who thought she'd found a rescuer, but something more complicated. Something like a woman who has been disappointed so many times that she is managing the act of hoping with extraordinary caution. My husband built that house, she said. We put in that kitchen ourselves. The kids grew up in it. Richard died in the bedroom. Her voice was absolutely level, which was somehow more devastating than any amount of crying would have been. I can't let strangers just take it. They're not strangers, Hollis said. They're thieves, she blinked. There's a difference, he said. Strangers can be helped. Thieves have to be stopped. He stood. The movement, as it always did, changed the atmosphere of the room instantly. Rope looked up from his table. So did 6 other men simultaneously, with the precision of people who had learned to read that particular signal. Hollis pulled out his wallet. He put $400 on the counter, cash hundreds, and set his coffee cup on top of it. For the meals, he said to Marlene, and hers. He nodded toward Evelyn. Evelyn's hand came out immediately. No, I'm not. The meal is paid, Hollis said with the calm finality of a man closing a door. That's not charity. That's just breakfast. He looked at her for a moment. What's your address? She stiffened. Why don't? Because I need to know where they're trying to take from you. The silence between them was long and weighted and full of everything that neither of them had any particular gift for saying. Evelyn Carter was not a woman who trusted easily, and especially not men who came in loud and covered in leather and commanded rooms by existing in them. But she was also not a fool. She had lived 71 years, and she had learned slowly and sometimes painfully that you could usually tell the difference between a man performing kindness and a man practicing it. She reached into her coat pocket, found a pen, found a receipt from 3 weeks ago that she'd kept for no particular reason. She wrote her address on the back of it and held it out. Hollis took it, looked at it, folded it once and put it in his vest pocket. Don't go anywhere, he said. I don't have anywhere to go, she replied, with a faint and terrible humor. He almost smiled. It was the almost that made Rope straighten up at his table, because in 20 years riding with Hollis Mercer, Rope could count on one hand the number of times he'd seen the man come close to smiling at a stranger. Hollis walked back to his table. He sat down. The diner, which had been pretending to go about its business throughout all of this, while actually doing nothing of the kind, seemed to collectively relearn how to breathe. Hollis picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and said to Rope very quietly, as if they were discussing weather or road conditions or any one of 100 ordinary things. I need you to find out everything there is to know about a county loan officer named Victor Doss. I need to know his address, his office hours, who he knows in the county government, and what holding company name he uses. Rope picked up his phone. How fast? Before we leave this parking lot. Rope nodded and started typing. Hollis looked out the window. The highway stretched out in both directions, empty and indifferent, the same highway it had always been. The sun was getting higher. It was going to be a clear day. Behind him, he could hear Tommy asking Emma if she thought the man with the scar was a pirate. Emma, with the authority of an older sister, said no, pirates don't drink coffee. Tommy considered this. What is he then? Emma was quiet for a moment. I don't know, she said, but I think he's on our side. Hollis said nothing. He stared at the highway and turned the address in his vest pocket over in his mind, the way a man turns a problem carefully from every angle, looking for the place where it opens. Victor Doss had stolen a dead man's house from a woman who was sitting 10 feet away trying to figure out how to feed her grandchildren on nothing. Hollis had spent 62 years learning exactly what he thought about people like Victor Doss. He set down his coffee cup. Rope. Yeah. Call Davis in Fresno. Tell him to pull the county records for deed transfers in the last 3 years, anything that went through that office. You think there's more? Hollis looked at Marlene, who was pretending to wipe the counter, while watching him with the cautious attention of someone who has been waiting for years for something to happen and is now not entirely sure she's ready for it. There's always more, he said. He stood for the second time, and this time when he moved toward the door, his men began to rise. Not with chaos, not with threat, with the quiet, synchronized certainty of 23 people who had learned to move through the world as one thing complicated and rough-edged and misunderstood, built from broken pieces and bad histories and hard-won loyalties, but one thing unmistakably when it mattered. Hollis paused at the door. He turned back once toward Evelyn Carter. She was watching him the way people watch a storm, with a kind of awed uncertainty, not knowing whether to be afraid or grateful or simply to bear witness. "We'll be in touch," he said. She nodded once with the careful dignity of a woman who had not yet allowed herself to hope. He pushed through the door. The motorcycle started. The sound was enormous and immediate and alive, filling the parking lot, and then the highway moving outward in every direction at once, the way sound does when it has nowhere left to be contained. Inside, Evelyn Carter sat with her hands flat on the counter and her 2 grandchildren in the booth behind her, and she listened to the engines until they faded, and then she sat in the sudden silence of Pearl's diner and breathed. Marlene came and refilled her water glass without being asked. Neither woman said anything. Outside, the highway was empty again, but something had changed in it, some quality of possibility that hadn't been there an hour ago. Something that felt tentatively, dangerously like the beginning of something being made right. Evelyn Carter looked down at her hands. She was still shaking, but it was different now. Rope got the information in 11 minutes. That was the thing about having 23 men with phones and connections stretching across 4 states. The world became a much smaller place. By the time Hollis had walked his bike to the far end of the parking lot and stood there with his arms crossed, looking at the highway, Rope was already at his elbow with a screen full of names and numbers and the particular kind of financial architecture that only gets built when someone is hiding something. Victor Doss, Rope said, scrolling. 44 years old, county loan facilitation officer, been in that position 11 years. Owns a house in Ridgecrest, paid off. Drives a new truck, F250, registered 8 months ago. Salary on record is $61,000 a year. Hollis looked at him. Nobody pays cash for a new F250 on $61,000 a year. Nobody legitimate, Rope agreed. There's a holding company, Cascade Valley Property Group, registered in Nevada, which means the trail gets intentionally messy, but the registered agent is a man named Phil Garrett, who happens to be the brother-in-law of the sheriff. Rope stopped scrolling. How'd you know? Because it's always the brother-in-law. Hollis took the phone, studied it, handed it back. How many properties? I've got 7 confirmed transfers in 3 years that went through Doss's office and ended up in Cascade Valley's portfolio. 3 of them, the previous owners were over 65, widowed, single income. The other 4 I haven't finished pulling yet. Pull them. Already am. Rope pocketed the phone. He was quiet for a second, which with Rope meant something was coming that he wasn't sure how to say. Hollis, this isn't just some local grifter skimming a little off the top. This looks organized. The documentation is too clean. The timing between the loan restructuring and the foreclosure notices, it's always between 60 and 90 days every single time. That's a pattern that was designed. Hollis said nothing. If the sheriff's in it and the county office is in it, whoever we push on is going to push back at us through official channels. That's a different kind of problem than the kind we usually handle. I know what kind of problem it is. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying, Rope. Hollis looked at him steadily. You think we should keep riding? Rope met his eyes. He was one of the few people in the world who could do that without flinching, which was one of the reasons Hollis kept him close. I think we could, yeah. She asked for leftovers. The words came out of Hollis flat and quiet and final, the way a judge sounds reading a verdict. She sat in there trying to figure out how to feed 2 children from what 23 men left on their plates. And the reason she's in that position is because some man in a county office decided her dead husband's house was more valuable than her life in it. Rope was quiet. We keep riding, Hollis said, and in 30 days they put her on the street, in the cold, with those two kids. Another silence. All right, Rope said, what do you need? Get Davis on the phone, not text call him. I need him to find me a real estate attorney who has already been looking at Cascade Valley. Somebody who has a reason to want this opened up in the standing to make noise that officials have to respond to. Rope raised an eyebrow. You think somebody's already looking? Something this organized running this long, somebody knows. Somebody's been trying to pull the thread and keep getting their hand slapped. Hollis took out the receipt with Evelyn's address and looked at it again. Find them. That's where we start. Rope pulled out his phone and walked away from the conversation already talking. Hollis stood alone at the edge of the parking lot and looked at nothing in particular and thought about a man he'd never met, Richard Carter, who'd built a house and an auto shop and a life and died without knowing that 14 months later, his wife would be sitting in a diner trying to survive on other people's scraps. There was a specific kind of anger that Hollis Mercer had spent 40 years learning to manage. It didn't run hot. It never had, not since he was young and stupid and let it make decisions for him. And it ran cold and it ran deep and it was patient in a way that made it more dangerous than the hot kind because the hot kind burns itself out. The cold kind just waits until the moment is exactly right. He turned and walked back toward the diner. Inside, Evelyn was still at the counter. She'd moved the children to the booth properly. Now Emma had apparently commandeered a pen from Marlene and was drawing something on a napkin with the focused intensity of a child who takes art seriously. Tommy had fallen asleep against the window with a piece of toast still in his hand, which Marlene had gently taken so it wouldn't fall. Evelyn was watching her grandchildren and holding her water glass, and she looked, Hollis thought, like a woman standing at the edge of something she was terrified to step back from and equally terrified to step toward. He sat down 2 stools away from her, not beside her, that would have been too familiar, but close enough that they could talk without performing it for the room. I need to ask you some questions, he said. She turned. About what? About the loan officer, the day you went in. Did you bring any documentation with you? The original mortgage papers, anything like that? I brought everything, she said, and there was a flash of something sharp in her voice, the intelligence of a woman who had been underestimated and knew it. I'd organized it all the night before. Richard kept files. He was very organized. I brought the original mortgage documents, the deed, 3 years of payment records. Everything. And Doss took copies. He took the originals. Hollis paused. He took your original deed. He said he needed them for the restructuring process. Said they'd be scanned and returned within the week. She pressed her lips together. They were never returned. Did you ask for them back? 4 times. He kept saying they were in processing. Then he stopped returning my calls entirely. She set down her water glass with a small, controlled precision. 3 weeks after my 4th call, I got the foreclosure notice from a company called Cascade Valley Property Group. Hollis felt something slot into place. The notice came from Cascade Valley directly, not from the bank. The bank sent a separate letter saying they'd been notified of the deed transfer and my loan account had been closed. She looked at him. He transferred my deed before the foreclosure. The loan was a cover. He never intended to restructure anything. He just needed a reason to get me into that office with my paperwork. The room, which had been maintaining a polite pretense of minding its own business, went a degree quieter. Hollis looked at her carefully. You understand exactly what he did. I had a very good attorney explain it to me, Evelyn said quietly. After the fact, she told me there was nothing she could do because the paperwork appeared legal and the sheriff's department had reviewed it and found no issue. A pause. She didn't say it directly, but I could tell she thought the sheriff's review was the problem, not the solution. What was her name? Evelyn hesitated. Patricia Wynn. She has an office in Tehachapi. Hollis turned. Rope. Rope was still on the phone 12 feet away. He looked up. Patricia Wynn, Tehachapi, real estate attorney. Find out everything about her. Rope held up one finger already on it and turned back to his call. Evelyn was watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone recalibrating their understanding of a situation in real time. Who are you calling? She asked. People who know people, Hollis said. The way things actually get done. The way what things get done, he looked at her directly. The thing you came in here this morning not knowing how to start. Her breath caught, just slightly, just enough that he saw it. I didn't come here to start anything. I came here because the children hadn't eaten, and this was the closest place, and she stopped, restarted with great deliberateness. I don't have any money, Mr. Hollis. I don't have any money, Hollis. I don't have resources. I don't have connections. What I have is 30 days and 2 grandchildren whose parents are in Sacramento, working double shifts to try to help, and her voice frayed at the exact edge where she'd been holding it together, and she pulled it back physically the way you'd pull a loose thread before it unravels something important. I don't know why you're still here. Because the problem isn't finished, he said simply. She stared at him. You think I'm going to make promises and disappear, he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't deny it. That's fair, he said. You don't know me. You've got no reason to believe a man who walked in here an hour ago on a motorcycle. He paused. But I'm going to tell you something true, and I need you to hear it. She was very still. Victor Doss has done this before, at least 7 times that we've found in the last 3 years. Probably more. He's got protection from the sheriff. He's got a holding company designed to make the paper trail complicated, and he's been operating with complete confidence that nobody with any power is going to look at him. Hollis leaned forward slightly. That's not criminal genius. That's criminal comfort, and comfort makes people sloppy. He kept your original documents. That's a mistake. He left a direct connection between himself and Cascade Valley in a county office filing. That's a mistake. And there's an attorney in Tehachapi who already knows something is wrong. He let that sit. The whole thing is one good pull away from coming apart. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. And you're going to pull it, she said. We're going to help pull it, he said. There's a difference. Why? The question was quiet and real, and without accusation, the genuine bewilderment of a woman who had been failed by enough systems that she'd stopped expecting help from unexpected directions. You don't know me. You rode in here this morning and you owe me nothing. Why? Hollis was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped, not with emotion, but with the weight of something he didn't say out loud very often. When I was 31 years old, he said, I came back from a place that had broken most of what worked right in me. I had nothing. I mean, that nothing. No money, no place to stay, no people I trusted enough to ask. I was sitting outside a diner in Arizona, not so different from this one, and I was trying to do the math on whether I could make a cup of coffee last long enough to get warm. He paused. A woman came out, older woman, probably your age. She had a to-go bag. She put it down in front of me and she said, I guessed at what you might like. And she went back inside. He looked at the counter. I never knew her name. I never got to thank her. She didn't want to be thanked. She just did it. He looked at Evelyn. You asked me why. That's why. The silence between them was different now. It had texture to it. Weight. Evelyn Carter looked at Jack Mercer for a long moment, and then for the first time since he'd walked through the door, her face did something it clearly hadn't done in quite some time. She let herself believe something might be all right. Rope appeared at Hollis's shoulder. He was off the phone, and his expression was the specific expression that meant he had found something significant and was deciding how much of it to say in front of a civilian. Step outside a second, Hollis said to him. They moved to the door. Hollis pushed it open, and they stood just outside, close enough that Hollis could still see Evelyn through the glass. Patricia Wynn, Rope said low and fast. She filed a complaint with the State Real Estate Fraud Division 8 months ago, specifically regarding Cascade Valley Property Group and a pattern of fraudulent deed transfers in Kern County. The complaint was received logged and, he paused, assigned to an investigator named Cole Merritt out of the Sacramento field office. And Merritt has been sitting on it for 8 months with no documented action taken, which could mean he's slow or could mean someone made a call. Hollis's jaw tightened. Or both. Yeah, or both. Rope scrolled. But here's the part you need to know. Wynn didn't stop at the state complaint. Davis found a federal filing HUD Housing and Urban Development Fraud Division submitted 6 months ago. Different investigator, federal jurisdiction. That one's still open, and it's been assigned to a field agent named Sandra Gao out of Los Angeles. Hollis looked at him. Active investigation. Appears so. Quiet but active. Rope pocketed his phone. Hollis, if we step into this wrong, if it looks like we're interfering with a federal investigation or shaking things up before they're ready to move, we could blow the whole thing apart before it lands. Or, Hollis said, we could give them exactly what they need to move faster. Or that, yeah. Can Davis get a message to Gownot official? Just let her know someone on the ground has found a victim with original documentation missing a direct paper connection between Doss and Cascade Valley and a willing witness. Rope thought about it. Davis knows a guy who used to work with HUD oversight. It's not a clean line, but it's a line. Use it. Rope nodded and pulled his phone back out. Hollis went back inside. Evelyn had moved to the booth with her grandchildren while he was outside. Emma had given up on the napkin drawing and was now leaning against her grandmother with her eyes half closed the way children do when they've finally gotten warm and full and feel safe enough to stop performing alertness. Tommy was still asleep. Evelyn's hand was moving slowly through Emma's hair, without her appearing to be aware she was doing it, the automatic tenderness of a woman who had spent decades being someone's comfort. Marlene was at the far end of the counter pretending to do inventory and very obviously not doing inventory. Hollis sat across from Evelyn in the booth. She looked at him with something new in her expression, a kind of cautious steadiness, like someone who has decided to stand their ground even though the ground is uncertain. I need something from you, he said. What? I need you to trust me enough to go home and stay there. Don't talk to Doss. Don't call the sheriff's department. Don't talk to anyone at the county office. If you get any new documentation notices, letters, anything, you photograph it, and you keep the original somewhere that isn't your house. Why not my house? Because if they get nervous, the first thing they'll do is try to remove evidence. And right now, some of your evidence might still be in your house without you knowing it. She processed that. You think they'd come into my home? I think, Hollis said carefully, that people who have been running a scheme this long and this smoothly don't give it up quietly. When pressure starts, they get careful. And careful people do things that protect themselves before they protect anyone else. Evelyn's hand had stilled in Emma's hair. You're telling me they might try to intimidate me. I'm telling you it's possible. And I'm telling you that if anyone from that county office contacts you, or if anything feels wrong, anything at all, I need you to call this number immediately. He pulled out a card. It was plain white with nothing on it but a phone number handwritten in ink. That number goes to me, not voicemail, me. She took the card, looked at it. You carry blank cards, she said. I carry blank cards, he agreed. Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, but the muscle memory of one. My husband would have found that either very suspicious or very impressive. Which would he have landed on? She looked at him for a moment. Impressive, she said. He respected practicality. Smart man. He was. The words were simple and certain and carried the full weight of 14 months of his absence. He really was. Hollis didn't offer anything to fill that space. He let it exist, which was the right thing to do, and also the harder thing, and Evelyn seemed to register that. The door of the diner swung open hard. Hollis was on his feet before the sound finished, because 40 years of learned reflex does not ask permission, and then he saw it wasn't a threat. It was a man. Late 50s county sheriff's deputy uniform, heavy-set, who had clearly pulled into the lot in the last few minutes and was now standing inside the door with his thumbs hooked in his belt, looking at the row of motorcycles through the window he'd just walked past. He looked at Hollis. Hollis looked at him. The deputy's eyes did a fast calculation. The patch is the size of the man, the number of bikes outside, and then they moved to Evelyn, and something in his face shifted. Not guilt exactly, something adjacent to it. Recognition. Mrs. Carter, he said, and his voice was doing a careful thing, the voice of a man performing a version of courtesy that has nothing courteous in it. Didn't expect to see you out this way. Evelyn's body had gone rigid. She was holding the card Hollis had given her, and she moved her hand below the table without making it obvious. Deputy Reeves, she said with the particular calm of a woman who has practiced staying composed in front of men who wanted her to come apart. Reeves looked at Hollis again. You and your crew just passing through. We were, Hollis said. We stopped for breakfast. Long stop. Good coffee. Marlene behind the counter had stopped pretending to do inventory. She was very still in the way that animals get still when something predatory enters a space. Reeves smiled. It didn't reach anywhere useful. Well, enjoy the rest of your ride. He looked back at Evelyn. Mrs. Carter, you know that situation with the property. The county office has been very clear about the timeline. You're going to want to start making arrangements. The words were delivered in the tone of a man saying something he'd said before to other people in the same casual, brutal register, as if a woman's home and her life inside it were a scheduling inconvenience. Evelyn said nothing. Hollis took one step forward. It was only one step. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch the deputy. He simply moved into the geometry of the conversation and changed it the way large objects change the behavior of things near them, just by existing. The lady's eating breakfast, Hollis said. Reeves looked up at him. The smile stayed, but something behind it recalculated. I'm just passing along information. You passed it along, Hollis said. She heard you. A beat of silence that had mass to it. Reeves's eyes moved around the diner. 23-minute tables, none of them looking at him directly, all of them absolutely aware of him. Marlene's hand was resting on the counter beside the phone. Emma had woken up and was watching the deputy with the clear-eyed, unfiltered assessment of a child who doesn't yet know she's supposed to pretend not to notice things. Have a good morning, Reeves said finally, and walked back out the door. The room exhaled. Hollis sat back down. Evelyn's hands were flat on the table. She was looking at the door. He reports to Doss, she said, or Doss reports through him. I was never sure which direction it ran. Doesn't matter which direction it runs, Hollis said. What matters is that he just told us something. She looked at him. He came in here, Hollis said. He saw your name in this parking lot somehow, or somebody called him when you were spotted, or he's been running a pattern on where you go. Either way, he felt the need to walk through that door and remind you of the timeline. That means somebody is watching you, and somebody got nervous the moment you weren't where they expected you to be. He looked at her steadily, which also means the moment we start pulling threads, they're going to feel it. Evelyn absorbed that. Are you afraid? She asked him. He thought about it honestly. Of Doss and a county sheriff. He shook his head. No. Should I be? He looked at her for a long moment. At Emma, who had fallen back against her grandmother's arm. At Tommy, still asleep, unbothered by the whole world. You should be smart, he said, and you already are. He stood. Go home, keep the card, keep your doors locked. And Evelyn, she looked up, don't let them make you feel like leaving is the only option. That's what they want. They want you to decide it's easier to go. Her chin came up, just slightly, just enough. I raised 3 children in that house, she said, and buried my husband from it. I am not leaving because some man in a county office wants my land. Hollis looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Good, he said. He walked toward the door and his crew, without a single word being spoken, began to rise. Evelyn drove home with both hands on the wheel and the card in her coat pocket, in the particular silence of someone who has been handed something fragile and is terrified of dropping it. Emma sat in the passenger seat and didn't ask questions, which was unusual enough that Evelyn glanced at her twice. Emma was 8 years old and normally produced questions the way a faucet produces water continuously without apparent effort about everything. But she sat with her hands in her lap and watched the road and finally said quietly, that man, the big one, he's going to help us, isn't he? It wasn't really a question. I don't know, sweetheart, Evelyn said, because she had spent 71 years believing that honesty was a form of respect, even when honesty was uncomfortable. Emma thought about this. I think he is, she said with the serene certainty of a child who has made a decision and sees no reason to revisit it. He has kind eyes. Evelyn said nothing. She thought about pale gray eyes that were absolutely calm in a way that had nothing to do with coldness. And she thought about a woman in Arizona putting a to-go bag down in front of a broken man, and she thought about the card in her pocket, and she drove. Tommy slept in the back seat the whole way home. The house looked the same as it always looked. That was the cruelest thing about a foreclosure notice. The house itself didn't know. The garden Richard had planted along the front walk was still there, dormant now, but structurally intact because Richard had built things to last. The porch light she'd left on since the night Richard died, because the dark felt different after that, was still burning in the pale morning light, unnecessary and faithful. The mailbox still had Carter stenciled on the side in black letters that Richard had painted himself with a small brush and a level and more patience than the job strictly required. Evelyn pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment after she turned off the engine. She thought about what Hollis had said. Someone is watching you. She looked at the street. It looked ordinary. It looked like a street on a Tuesday morning where nothing was happening. But she thought about Deputy Reeves walking into that diner and the way his eyes had moved to her immediately and the precise timing of it, and she felt the hair on her arms rise under her coat. She got the children inside, got Tommy onto the couch with a blanket, and stood in her kitchen and looked at the card. One phone number. Nothing else. She put it on the counter where she could see it and started a pot of coffee and tried to figure out how to wait. She was not good at waiting. Richard had always said so. He'd said it fondly, which made the memory of it land in her chest like a small stone. Evelyn Carter, he used to say, is the only person I know who can make patience look like an act of aggression. She'd always made things happen, committees, school boards, the neighborhood association, the church fundraiser that rebuilt the community center roof in 2009. Waiting had always felt to her like surrender. But she made the coffee, and she sat, and she waited. She didn't have to wait long. Her phone rang at 11:43. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She'd been getting calls from numbers she didn't recognize for 3 weeks, and twice it had been representatives from Cascade Valley Property Group asking her in voices of practiced sympathy whether she needed assistance finding alternative housing. She picked up. Mrs. Carter. A woman's voice, professional, direct, with the particular controlled energy of someone who chooses every word before it leaves their mouth. My name is Patricia Wynn. I'm an attorney in Tehachapi. I represented you briefly last spring regarding your property matter. Evelyn sat up straight. Miss Wynn, yes, I remember. I told you at the time that my hands were tied. I want you to know that hasn't changed officially. A pause. Unofficially, I received a message about 2 hours ago from a contact I trust that suggested you'd had an encounter this morning with some individuals who may have information relevant to your case. Evelyn looked at the card on the counter. How did they reach you? Through a channel I don't fully understand, Wynn said with the tone of a woman who finds this slightly irritating and also extremely interesting. Mrs. Carter, I need to ask you something directly. Do you still have any original documentation? Anything Doss didn't take? I have copies, Evelyn said. I made copies of everything before I went in that day. Richard always said to keep copies. Her throat tightened. He was organized. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds, which Evelyn sensed was 2 seconds of Patricia Wynn recalibrating everything. You have copies of the original deed, and the mortgage documents, and 3 years of payment records. Another pause. Longer this time. Mrs. Carter, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not tell anyone you have those documents. Not neighbors, not the county office, nobody. Can you put them somewhere outside your house today? A safety deposit box, a trusted family member, not nearby, preferably out of the county. You think they'd come into my home? I think, Wynn said precisely, that when certain people realize that the piece of evidence they thought they had full control of actually has a shadow copy, they sometimes take action to correct that situation. I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it because you've survived this long by being smart, and I need you to keep being smart for a little while longer. Evelyn stood up from the kitchen table. She was already moving toward the bedroom where she kept the filing cabinet. How long is a little while longer? I don't know exactly, but something is moving. After 8 months of nothing, something is finally moving. Wynn's voice carried the controlled relief of someone who has been pushing against a locked door and just felt it shift. The message I received suggested there may be federal involvement that I wasn't previously aware of. If that's true and I have no way to confirm it yet, then the timeline compresses significantly. What does that mean for me, for my house? It means that if this goes where I think it might go, the illegal foreclosure orders could be suspended pending investigation. Possibly within days, not weeks. A beat. But Mrs. Carter, it also means the next few days are the most dangerous part. People who are about to be exposed tend to move quickly to protect themselves, which sometimes means doubling down on the pressure they're already applying. As if the universe had been listening and decided to offer a demonstration. Evelyn's doorbell rang. She stopped moving. Ms. Wynn, she said very quietly, someone's at my door. Don't answer it if you don't recognize who it is. Evelyn moved to the front window, looked out carefully the way Hollis had made her feel she should not, obviously not, by opening anything, just to look through the gap in the curtain. It was not Deputy Reeves. It was a man she didn't recognize in a jacket that might have been business casual or might have been deliberately designed to look that way. He was holding a folder. "There's a man I don't know," she told Wynne, holding paperwork. "Then he's from Cascade Valley or the county office. Do not open the door. Whatever he's delivering, it's designed to pressure you or to get you on record saying or signing something." Wynne's voice was absolutely steady. "Let it go. If it's legal process, it can be served through proper channels. You don't have to open the door." The doorbell rang again. Evelyn stood in her hallway and breathed. Tommy was on the couch 12 feet away, asleep under his blanket, completely unaware that anything was happening. Emma was in the kitchen. Through the wall, Evelyn could hear Emma opening and closing cabinets with the particular purposeful noise of a child who has decided she is going to help and has chosen making a snack as her contribution to the situation. The man rang the doorbell a third time, then knocked twice hard, then after a long pause walked back to his car and drove away. Evelyn exhaled so completely that she had to put one hand on the wall. "He's gone," she said. "Good," Wynne said. "Now, the documents. Where can you take them in the next hour?" It was Hollis's voice in her head. "Keep the card. Keep your doors locked." And Evelyn looked at the card on the kitchen counter and made a decision. "I'll figure it out," she said. "Ms. Wynne, the people who reached out to you, do you know who they are?" A pause. "I have some idea," Wynne said carefully. "Let's say I'm less concerned about who they are than I am about whether they mean what they appear to mean." "And do they?" Another pause, longer. "In my experience," Wynne said, "people who are going to say something and not follow through, they don't go to the trouble they appear to have gone to. Whatever this is, someone spent real effort on it." Her voice shifted slightly, losing one precise layer of professional distance. "Mrs. Carter, I want to be honest with you. 8 months ago, I filed a complaint and then watched it disappear into a system that is not clean. I almost stopped believing this was going to go anywhere." She stopped. "I'm not going to stop believing that anymore. Not today." Evelyn stood in her hallway with her hand on the wall and her late husband's garden visible through the front window and her grandchildren in the next room, and she thought about 30 days, and she thought about Richard painting Carter on the mailbox with a small brush and too much patience, and she thought about a man with gray eyes who said he was just returning something a stranger had given him once. "Neither am I," she said. She hung up and picked up the card and dialed the number. It rang once. "Evelyn?" Not a question. He'd known it was her before she spoke, which should have unsettled her and somehow didn't. "A man came to my door," she said. "From Cascade Valley, I think. I didn't open it. He left." "Good." His voice was the same as it had been in the diner. Bedrock. "You called Wynne?" "She called me." A beat. "That was fast." It needed to be fast. "Hollis." She sat down at the kitchen table. Emma appeared in the doorway with 2 crackers and a look of profound helpfulness, and Evelyn smiled at her and mouthed "thank you" and waited until Emma retreated before continuing. "Someone is watching this house, or watching me. Reeves knew I was at that diner." "I know." "How did he know?" "Oh, could be a contact at Pearl's. Could be a pattern if Cascade Valley has been monitoring your movements to confirm you haven't left the area yet. Reeves would have access to that." A pause. "Evelyn, the documents Wynne asked about, can you get them out of the house today? I have a sister in Victorville, 3 hours away. Can she come to you, or do you need to go to her?" I can't leave the children here alone, and I don't know if I should be." "Call your sister. Tell her you need her to come. Don't tell her why on the phone. When she gets there, give her the documents personally. Don't mail them, don't scan them, and send them electronically." His voice was measured and very clear, each sentence landing where it needed to land. "This is the most important piece. Once those documents are outside your house and in Wynne's hands, Doss loses the ability to claim the originals don't exist. Patricia Wynne already has copies, I just told her. She has your copies. When the case moves, they're going to need to be verified against the originals that Doss took. And if Doss still has those originals, his defense is going to be that yours are fabricated." He paused. "But if there's a federal chain of custody on your copies with a timestamp that predates whatever he's likely done with the originals, that's a different story." Evelyn pressed her fingers to her eyes briefly. "You know a great deal about how this works. I've watched a lot of systems fail people, he said, and I've learned what makes them fail less. A silence. Where are you? She asked. 40 miles east, he said. Moving. Moving where? Oh. He didn't answer that directly. The federal investigator, her name is Sandra Gao. She's in Los Angeles. She's had an active file on Cascade Valley for 6 months, and she's been waiting for something she can move on. What she didn't have was a living victim with a documentation. Another pause. She has that now. Evelyn's breath went still. You contacted a federal investigator. Someone who knows someone made a call. Hollis, if this is real, if this actually moves. She stopped. She was trying to keep her voice level, and it was harder than it had been in the diner because now she was in her own kitchen, in her own house that wasn't entirely hers anymore, and the stakes of believing were enormous and terrifying. How long? Days, he said, maybe less. 3 hours later, Rope was sitting in the parking lot of a storage facility in Bakersfield, with his phone in both hands reading through a document that Davis had pulled from the Kern County Recorder's office through channels that were technically public record, but practically invisible if you didn't know exactly where to look. The document was a transfer of deed for 7 properties over 38 months, all processed through Victor Doss's office, all transferred to Cascade Valley Property Group within 90 days of the initial loan restructuring application. The names on the original deeds read like a list assembled by someone looking specifically for vulnerability, elderly, recently widowed, single-income, modest assets, isolated enough that the usual community support networks were thin. Rope sent it to Hollis. His phone buzzed 30 seconds later. One word back. Good. Rope stared at the document and thought about something he didn't say out loud very often, which was that in 20 years riding with Hollis Mercer, he had watched the man walk away from 100 situations that were technically someone else's problem. He had watched him make the calculation between involvement and cost and come out the other side, choosing to keep moving, and it had never been cowardice. It had been strategy. The management of limited resources, the understanding that you cannot fix everything, and the wisdom to identify what you can. But today had been different. Today, Hollis had heard a woman ask for leftovers, and something in him had stopped calculating. Rope didn't ask about it. He wasn't that kind of second in command, and Hollis wasn't that kind of man. But he thought about it as he drove, and he thought the thing he had observed over 20 years was true. The things that actually moved Hollis Mercer were never the big things. They were always the small ones. The specific ones. A woman was shaking hands in a thin coat doing the math on how to feed 2 children from the remains of strangers' meals. His phone buzzed again. A different number, Davis. He answered. The federal investigator, Davis said without preamble. Gao. She called back. She wants a meeting. Not official, not recorded. She wants to talk to whoever made the initial contact. Rope was very still. When, tonight, there's a truck stop off the I-5 near Wheeler Ridge. She'll be there at 8. Hollis isn't going to want to be in a room with a federal agent. Then send someone who is, Davis said simply. Rope thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. All right, he said. I'll go. He called Hollis. Gao wants a meeting, he said, tonight. Wheeler Ridge truck, stop 8 o'clock. Hollis was quiet for a moment. Who goes? I think it should be me. You walking into a meeting with a federal agent is complicated, Hollis agreed. Yeah, you go. Take Hendricks. Hendricks was the crew member who had in a previous life spent 6 years as a paralegal in Sacramento before the sequence of events that had made him something different. Bring everything Davis pulled, every document, and Rope. Yeah, she's going to want something from us in return for moving on this. She's going to want assurance that whatever we know about Doss's operations came from public record and legitimate sources. Did it? A pause that lasted exactly the right amount of time. Everything Davis pulled was public record, Hollis said. The chain of custody is clean. And the rest? There is no rest, Hollis said. There's just a woman named Evelyn Carter with her husband's name on a mailbox and 30 days before someone takes it from her. That's all there is. Rope drove and the afternoon burned down around him, and the desert stretched out in every direction the way it always did, indifferent, enormous, waiting for whatever humans decided to do to each other next. At 6:15, his phone rang again. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go. Then something made him answer. This Rope. A man's voice, low, cautious. Who's asking? My name's not important. What's important is that I work in the Kern County Recorder's Office, and I've been watching the Cascade Valley transfers for 2 years because one of the properties they took belonged to my aunt. A pause. Ragged breathing. The breathing of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has just decided to stop being afraid, which is a different kind of fear entirely. I have the original documents, the ones Doss took. I made copies before he had them sent to the holding company's attorney. Another pause. I've been trying to figure out who to give them to without getting myself killed or fired or both. And then somebody in the office got a very nervous phone call today from Victor Doss, and after the call they started shredding things, and I decided today was the day. Rope pulled over. He sat on the side of the road and he breathed, and he thought about Hollis saying, "The whole thing is one good pull away from coming apart." "Are you safe right now?" Rope said. "I'm in my car in a parking lot in Mojave. I took everything I had and I left. I don't know if they know I took it yet." "What's your name?" A long pause. "Martin Trevino." "Martin, listen to me. Do not go home tonight. Do you have someone you can stay with outside the county?" "My brother's in Lancaster." "Go to your brother's. Don't stop anywhere you'd normally stop. And call this number back in 20 minutes and tell me you got there." "Why 20 minutes?" "Because I need to make a phone call," Rope said, "and you need to be moving while I make it." He hung up and sat in the silence of the car for exactly 3 seconds and then called Hollis. "We have a witness," he said, "inside the county recorder's office. He has the originals." The silence on the other end was very brief. "Where is he now?" "In his car, heading to Lancaster." Rope could hear his own pulse. "Hollis, he said Doss made a phone call to the county office today. After that call, someone started shredding. They know something's moving." "Yeah, then we have less time than I thought." His voice hadn't changed, still flat, still bedrock. But Rope knew that voice, and he knew that beneath the flatness, the calculations were running faster now. "Get Martin Trevino to his brother's house. Get Hendricks and the documents to Wheeler Ridge at 8. And tell Davis to call Wynn and tell her to be by her phone tonight." "What are you going to do?" A pause. "I'm going to drive to Evelyn Carter's house," Hollis said, "and make sure nobody visits her before morning." Evelyn heard the motorcycle before she saw it. She was in the kitchen at 7:40 in the evening, standing at the counter with a cup of tea she hadn't drunk because it had gone cold while she was staring at the phone waiting for it to do something. Her sister Carol had come and gone, 3 hours of driving for a 20-minute exchange. Carol arriving with the particular determined calm of an older sibling who has decided that panic is not a useful contribution to a crisis, taking the documents without asking too many questions, squeezing Evelyn's hands once very hard, and driving back toward Victorville with the copies of Richard's deed and mortgage in a manila envelope on her passenger seat. The children were upstairs. Tommy was asleep again. Tommy had the gift of being able to sleep through disruption the way plants grow through concrete completely and without apology. Emma was reading or pretending, to which for Emma meant lying on her bed with a book open in front of her face and her eyes not moving across the page. The sound of the single motorcycle was different from the convoy of the morning. One engine, not 23. It came down her street at a speed that said, "This is not a visit, this is a post," and it stopped in front of her house and did not turn off. Evelyn went to the window and looked through the gap in the curtain, the way she'd learned to look today, carefully and directly, without announcing herself. Hollis was on his motorcycle at the curb. He wasn't coming to the door. He was simply there, engine idling position, so that he could see both ends of the street, like a man who has chosen a spot and intends to stay in it. Evelyn stared at him for a moment. Then she put on her coat, went out the front door, and walked down the porch steps to the street. He looked at her when she came out. He didn't seem surprised that she'd come. "You don't have to stand out here," she said. "I know. It's cold." "I know that too." She stood on the sidewalk and looked at him and tried to find the right thing to say, which was difficult, because the thing she wanted to say was something like, "Thank you for existing," which was not a sentence she'd ever had occasion to say to anyone and wasn't sure she could say without embarrassing both of them. "Rope is at Wheeler Ridge," she said instead, "meeting with the federal investigator." "Yes. You're not worried about how that goes. Rope is very capable. You trust him completely." "With everything," Hollis said in the tone of a man stating a fact that requires no elaboration. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter. The porch light was on. It was always on, and it threw a pale gold light over the front walk in the dormant garden and the mailbox with Carter and Richard's careful letters. She looked at the mailbox, and she thought about what it meant that it was still there, still saying his name, still insisting on his presence even after everything that had tried to erase it. "My husband would have wanted to come out and shake your hand," she said. Hollis said nothing. "He was a man who believed very strongly in acknowledging when someone did something good," she continued. "He used to say that the reason people stop doing good things is that nobody notices." She paused. "He would have noticed." Hollis looked at her for a moment. "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was the best person I ever met," Evelyn said simply and completely, without performance. "And I knew him for 46 years, which sounds like a long time until it isn't enough." The street was quiet around them. Somewhere 2 blocks away, a dog barked twice and stopped. "Go inside," Hollis said, not unkindly. "Lock the door. I'll be here. All night, until I'm sure you don't need me to be." Evelyn looked at him for one more moment and then did what he said, because she had spent a lifetime knowing the difference between a man who gives an instruction and a man who gives a protection, and this was the second kind. She went inside and locked the door and went back to her cold tea and her phone and her waiting. At Wheeler Ridge Rope had been sitting in a corner booth of a truck stop for 22 minutes when a woman walked in who moved like someone who had learned to enter rooms without being noticed and had spent long enough doing it that she no longer had to try. Sandra Gao was 43, Chinese-American with short hair and the kind of face that gave away exactly what she chose to give away, and nothing else. She was wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark jeans, and she carried nothing except her phone and a leather folder no larger than a paperback book. She looked like someone's accountant. She looked like someone who had made a deliberate career out of looking like someone's accountant. She saw Rope and sat down across from him without introduction. "You're not who I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone older, maybe. Someone who looked more like a lawyer." She studied him. "You're his second in command." Rope did not ask how she knew that. "I am." "Where is he?" "Somewhere he needs to bail." Gao nodded once as if this confirmed something she'd already understood. "Your contact reached out to me 6 hours ago. Before that, I had a case file, 6 months of paper, 2 witnesses who wouldn't go on record, and a state investigator in Sacramento who has been sitting on a related complaint since last year without moving." She set the leather folder on the table. "What I did not have was a living victim willing to cooperate, a chain of custody on documentation that Doss thought he'd fully controlled, and an inside source in the county recorder's office." "You know about Trevino," Rope said carefully. "I know someone matching that description called a number connected to your network approximately 3 hours ago, and subsequently removed himself in a significant quantity of documentation from Kern County." She looked at him without expression. "I'm not asking how you found him. I'm telling you that if he's willing to come forward formally with the documents, he took this case moves from active investigation to federal prosecution within 72 hours. Rope was very still. 72 hours. Possibly less. I've been waiting for exactly this piece for 4 months. The deed transfer mechanism is clear. The paper trail between Doss and Cascade Valley is clear. The connection to Sheriff Garrett's brother-in-law is clear. What has not been clear," she opened the folder, turned it toward him, showed him a page dense with legal notation, "is whether I can establish that the fraud is systematic rather than incidental. Systematic fraud elevates the charge. Systematic fraud with documented victims is federal RICO territory." Hendricks, who had been sitting beside Rope in silence for the past 20 minutes, in the manner of someone who has learned to be furniture when the situation requires it, leaned forward very slightly. "7 properties over 38 months, he said, "all processed through the same office, all following the same 60 to 90-day timeline from restructuring application to foreclosure notice, all transferred to the same holding company." He slid a folder across the table, the documents Davis had pulled from public record. "If that's not systematic, I'd like to know your definition." Gao looked at the folder. She picked it up. She read it with the speed of someone who reads dense documentation for a living, her eyes moving down each page with controlled efficiency. She turned to the second page. The third. She set it down. "Where did you pull this?" "Kern County Recorder's Office," Hendricks said. "Public record. Chain of custody is clean." "I know it's public record," she said. "I pulled most of it myself 6 months ago. What I didn't have," She tapped a specific page as this notation. This cross-reference between the Cascade Valley registration and the Nevada filing that links the LLC directly back to Doss's personal attorney. She looked up. Where did you find this? Hendricks looked at Rope. Rope looked at Gao. Public record, he said again steadily. She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once and closed the folder. 72 hours, she said. Maybe less. But I need Trevino. I need him safe. I need him willing. And I need the documents he removed to be surrendered through proper channels so they're admissible. We can do that. And the victim, Evelyn Carter. Gao's voice shifted slightly, just enough that Rope noticed the professional surface developing one precise crack of something human. She's been alone in this for over a year. What's her current situation? She has 30 days on the foreclosure. A deputy from the sheriff's department showed up at her location this morning and reminded her of the timeline. He paused. Someone from Cascade Valley showed up at her house this afternoon while we were still coordinating. Gao's jaw tightened. They're escalating. They're scared, Rope said. Doss made a phone call to the county office today. After the call, someone started shredding documents. The silence that followed was brief and extremely dense. He knows, Gao said. He suspects. He doesn't know what or how much, which makes him more dangerous, not less. She stood up, which was not what Rope expected. I need to make a call. Stay here. She walked out of the truck stop. Through the window, Rope could see her standing in the parking lot with her phone at her ear, speaking with the controlled urgency of someone delivering information up a chain that had been waiting for exactly this. Hendricks looked at Rope. She's moving tonight, he said. Yeah, Rope said. I think she is. His phone buzzed. Hollis, Trevino make it to Lancaster. Rope typed back. Yes. Confirmed 20 minutes ago. 3 seconds later, good. What's Gao saying? Rope typed 72 hours. Maybe less. She needs Trevino formal. She's making a call right now. The response took longer this time. Rope counted to 12 before it came. Tell her about the shredding. Tell her if they're destroying evidence tonight, she might not have 72 hours. Rope stared at the message. Gao came back through the door. She sat down, and before she could say anything, Rope said, the shredding started today, after Doss's call to the county office. If there are documents in that office being destroyed tonight, I know, she said. Her voice was different now. The accountant's surface was gone. What was underneath it was sharp and certain and moving fast. I just spoke with my supervising agent. We're filing for an emergency preservation order tonight, which means serving Doss, the county recorder's office, and Cascade Valley's registered agent simultaneously before morning. She looked at Rope directly. This has moved up. How far up? Tonight, she said. We move tonight. Rope called Hollis before he was out of the booth. Tonight, he said the moment Hollis picked up. Gao is moving tonight. Emergency preservation orders. They're serving Doss before morning. The silence on Hollis's end lasted 4 seconds. Does Evelyn know? He said. Not yet. I'll tell her. He hung up and sat on his motorcycle in front of Evelyn Carter's house and looked at the porch light and thought about how to tell a woman who had been bracing for 30 days of waiting that the waiting was almost over. He thought about how people receive good news after they've been surviving bad news for long enough. How it doesn't always feel like relief immediately. How sometimes it feels first like the specific terror of allowing yourself to believe something. He knocked on the door. Evelyn answered in 30 seconds, still in her coat, still holding her phone, which told him she hadn't put either down since she'd come back inside. Rope called from Wheeler Ridge, Hollis said. The federal investigator. She's moving tonight. Evelyn stared at him. Tonight, he said again. They're filing emergency orders. Doss will be served before morning. The foreclosure on your property will be flagged as evidence in an active federal investigation, which means it can't proceed while the investigation is open. She kept staring. Evelyn, I heard you, she said. Her voice was very quiet. I heard every word. She stopped. Put her hand over her mouth briefly. Put it down. I've been trying not to hope, she said. I've been doing everything you told me and talking to Wynn and sending Carol away with those papers and trying very hard not to let myself believe this was real, because if I believe it and it doesn't, it's real, he said. You can't know that for certain. No, he admitted. Not with certainty, but Sandra Gao has been building this case for 6 months, And tonight she has everything she needed. And a federal preservation order is not something Victor Doss can make disappear with a phone call to a county sheriff. Evelyn's hand came up again. She pressed it to her eyes this time and held it there for a moment, and Hollis stood at her door and waited with the patience of a man who understands that some things have to move through a person before the person can speak again. When she lowered her hand, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He shook his head. "I'm going to stay outside." "Hollis, it's cold." "I know." She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen directed at him in a very long time. Something between exasperation and gratitude, and the particular warmth that people reserve for those who insist on doing the difficult thing when the easier thing is available. "You are a very stubborn man," she said. "I've been told." "My husband was stubborn like that," she said. "He would have liked you very much." And then before he could respond, before the silence could grow to the size where something needed to fill it, "I'll bring coffee out." She went back inside. Through the window he could see the kitchen light and her moving in it, and the ordinary, faithful miracle of a woman in her own home making coffee. His phone buzzed. Davis. "Gao's team is in motion. 3 agents out of Bakersfield office, 2 more from LA. They're coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office tonight. Doss's home address is flagged, the county office is flagged, Cascade Valley's Nevada registered agent is flagged. This is not a soft inquiry. This is a raid." Hollis read it twice. He typed back one word. "Good." Then he sat on his motorcycle in the cold and watched the street and waited. And after a few minutes, the front door opened, and Evelyn came out with 2 mugs of coffee and handed him one without ceremony, and he took it, and they stood there together in the porch light, this 71-year-old widow and this 62-year-old man who had ridden in from nowhere, and they drank their coffee and didn't say much, and the street was quiet around them. At 11:17 that night, Victor Doss opened his front door in Ridgecrest in his bathrobe and found 3 federal agents on his porch with a preservation order, a search warrant, and a set of questions he was not going to be able to answer without a lawyer. Rope got the call from Davis at 11:42 and called Hollis immediately. "It's done," he said. They served him. Hollis was still outside Evelyn's house. The coffee was long finished. The porch light was still on. "The sheriff," he asked. "Separate team, simultaneous service." Garrett got a call from his brother-in-law's attorney 20 minutes before federal agents knocked on his door. Somebody tipped the attorney, which Gao apparently anticipated, because the moment the attorney made that call, they had him for obstruction on top of everything else. Hollis was quiet. "It's done," Rope said again. "Evelyn's house, the foreclosure is frozen. Federal hold. Nobody can touch it while the investigation is open," and Gao told Davis this investigation is going to be open for a very long time. He looked at the porch light. He thought about what tomorrow was going to look like, the calls that would need to be made, the way Evelyn would have to navigate the legal aftermath, even as the crisis lifted the long, slow work of restoration that follows the immediate work of rescue. He thought about Patricia Wynn and Martin Trevino, and the 6 other families whose names were on those deed transfer documents, all of whom were going to wake up tomorrow in a different landscape than the one they'd gone to sleep in. He thought about a woman in Arizona who had put down a to-go bag without leaving her name. He knocked on Evelyn's door. She answered quickly, which meant she'd been awake, which he'd expected. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. "Doss was served an hour ago. Federal agents. The foreclosure on your property is frozen pending investigation. You're not going anywhere." Evelyn Carter stood in her doorway and looked at Jack Mercer and did the thing that she had been holding back all day, with both hands, the thing that 71 years of composure and pride and the particular stubbornness of a woman who refuses to come apart in front of people had been keeping behind a very carefully maintained wall. She cried. Not loudly, not in the way of someone performing grief or relief for an audience, in the quiet, private, completely unstoppable way of someone in whom something has finally, after a very long time, been allowed to release. Hollis stood at the door and did not look away and did not offer a single word, because words would have been the wrong thing. He simply stood there and let her have it, all of it, the 14 months of grief and fear and the indignity of the diner this morning, and the man at the door with the folder and the cold tea and the waiting, all of it, until it had moved through her and the crying slowed and she straightened and pressed the back of her hand to her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. She breathed once deeply, the breath of someone refilling a space that had been empty a long time. Is it really over? The immediate part, he said. The legal part takes longer, but your house. He looked at the mailbox. At Carter, in patient, careful letters, your house is yours. She followed his eyes to the mailbox. And for the first time since Richard had died, Evelyn Carter looked at her husband's name on their mailbox and did not feel it as a wound. She felt it as a fact, an anchor, a thing that held. Thank you, she said. It came out barely above a whisper, but it had the weight of something that had been meant completely. Hollis nodded once, the way a man accepts something he was never going to ask for. Lock your door, he said. Get some sleep. He walked back to his motorcycle. He didn't look back because that wasn't the kind of man he was. But he heard just before the engine started the sound of her front door closing and the lock turning, and then nothing, the quiet of a house settling into safety for the first time in a very long time. He pulled away from the curb and the porch light fell behind him and the street emptied out, the way streets do when the thing that needed to happen in them has finally happened. Evelyn slept for 9 hours straight, which was something she hadn't done since the night before Richard's diagnosis. She didn't plan it. She locked the door the way Hollis told her to, checked on the children, Tommy still impossibly asleep. Emma curled on her side with the book finally closed and sat down on the edge of her bed, meaning to think, meaning to process, meaning to do the careful, deliberate accounting of everything that had happened in a single day that had somehow contained more life than the previous 14 months combined. Instead, she was simply gone. No dreaming she could remember. No waking at 2 a.m. with the familiar weight of dread sitting on her chest, just dark, and then pale morning light through the curtains and the smell of coffee. She sat up fast. Someone was in her kitchen. Then she heard Emma's voice. I know how to do it, Tommy. I do it all the time. And Tommy's skeptical response, you burned the toast on Saturday. And Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed and pressed both hands to her face and laughed. She laughed in the quiet, private way that is almost indistinguishable from crying, which she supposed was appropriate since the two had been taking turns all day yesterday. She came downstairs to find Emma standing at the counter with the focused expression of a surgeon and Tommy sitting at the kitchen table with the deeply unconvinced expression of someone who has been burned before, literally and figuratively. Emma had made coffee, real coffee, not the child approximation of it, because Emma had watched her grandmother make coffee approximately 500 times and had apparently been paying close attention and had produced toast that was only slightly darker than ideal. Good morning, Emma said with the dignity of someone who has completed a mission. Good morning, sweetheart, Evelyn said. I made coffee. I can see that. Tommy said I'd burn it, but you can't burn coffee. You can only burn toast, and the toast is fine. The toast is slightly dark, Tommy said. It's fine, Emma said. Evelyn poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table between them and looked at her grandchildren in her kitchen, in her house, and felt the specific, almost unbearable sweetness of ordinary things that have almost been taken from you and haven't been. Are we okay? Emma asked. She asked it directly the way she always asked things, looking at her grandmother with those clear, patient eyes that missed nothing and pretended to miss nothing. Evelyn looked at her granddaughter. Yes, she said. We're okay. Emma considered this. Is it because of the man with the motorcycle? Partly, Evelyn said honestly. I knew he was on our side, Emma said, and went back to her toast with the serene satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been confirmed. The phone rang at 8:40. Patricia Wynn, her voice carrying the compressed energy of someone who has been awake most of the night and is running on adrenaline, in the specific satisfaction of watching something she built finally move. The preservation orders were served at 11:15 last night, Wynn said without preamble. Doss, the county recorder's office, Cascade Valley's registered agent in Nevada, and this is the part that changes everything, the law firm that handled the deed transfer documentation for all 7 properties. Evelyn sat very still. All 7. All 7. The federal agents went in with a scope that covers every transaction Cascade Valley ran through Kern County in the past 4 years. And Mrs. Carter, Wynn paused, and in the pause was something Evelyn had never heard from this woman before, something warm and almost disbelieving. Sheriff Garrett resigned at 6:30 this morning. He resigned, submitted his resignation to the county board chair by email. His attorney issued a statement saying he is cooperating fully with federal investigators. A pause, which means he's talking, which means he's giving them everything they need about Doss in exchange for whatever deal he thinks he can make. Wynn's voice sharpened. Doss doesn't have that option anymore. He's the one they want. Garrett just handed him to them. Evelyn stood up from the table. She walked to the kitchen window without knowing she was doing it and looked out at the garden at the dormant roses Richard had planted along the back fence 11 years ago that came back every spring without being asked to. Is it over? She said. The same question she'd asked Hollis last night, but different now, asked of a different person in daylight with the specific sobriety of morning. The criminal part is just beginning, Wynn said. Federal prosecution moves slowly. Doss will lawyer up there, will be proceedings. It could take a year or more before anything is resolved in court. She paused. But the foreclosure on your property is frozen indefinitely. And I filed an emergency motion at 6 this morning to have the deed transferred to Cascade Valley invalidated on the basis of fraud. Given that we now have a federal investigation confirming that fraud, I expect the motion to be granted within the week. Within the week, Evelyn repeated. Your house was never legally theirs, Wynn said with a precision that had 30 years of law behind it. The paperwork appeared legal. It was designed to appear legal, but the original deed transfer was obtained through documented fraud, and when fraud voids a transaction, the transaction is void from the beginning, which means it was always mine. It was always yours, Wynn confirmed. We're just making the paperwork catch up to the truth. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and listened to the quiet of her own house and thought about Richard, who had believed so completely in the idea that truth was a structural thing, that it held weight, that it bore load, that if you built on it correctly, it would not give way. She thought he would have found great satisfaction in the phrase the paperwork catching up to the truth. He would have nodded in the measured, deliberate way he nodded when something confirmed what he'd already believed and said something like, that's how it should work, as if it were simple, as if it were just engineering. Ms. Wynn, Evelyn said, the other families, the other 6 properties. A pause. That's the next fight, Wynn said, and it won't be easy. Each case is separate. Each deed transfer will have to be challenged individually. Some of them may have been sold on already by Cascade Valley, which adds layers of legal complexity. She paused. But the federal investigation covers all of them. And now that Garrett is cooperating, we have documentation of a pattern that will make each individual case stronger. Another pause. I'm going to need help. Resources, legal support, somebody to organize the other victims. This is bigger than my office in Tehachapi. Tell me what you need, Evelyn said. I need time, Wynn said. I need you to be patient for a few more days while the immediate pieces settle. And then, she seemed to choose the next words carefully. There are people who have been helping move this. I don't fully understand who or how, but whoever they are, if they're willing to stay involved in any capacity, I'll ask, Evelyn said. She hung up and stood in her kitchen for a moment, and then she picked up the card with the single handwritten phone number and dialed it. It rang 3 times, which was longer than before. When Hollis answered, he sounded like a man who had slept approximately as much as she had, which is to say, not very. Garrett resigned, she said. I know. A pause. Davis called an hour ago. Wynn says the deed transfer can be invalidated within the week. Good. The other 6 families, she said. Wynn needs support, legal resources, someone to organize the other victims. She said she can't do it alone from Tehachapi. She paused. I told her I'd ask. The silence that followed was not long, but it was considered. She had learned already that Hollis's silences were not empty. They were full of the specific weight of a man actually thinking before he spoke, which she had come to understand was rarer than it should be. I know people, he said finally, in Sacramento, a legal advocacy organization that handles exactly this kind of coordinated fraud case. They've been looking for a reason to come into Kern County for 2 years. You know them? I know the woman who runs it. We helped her organization with something else a few years back. He paused. She's good. She'll take the other cases. Will you connect her to Wynn? Already making a note. Evelyn almost smiled. You were going to do that regardless of whether I asked. I was considering it, he said, which was as close to yes as she suspected he ever got. She looked out the window again. The roses, the fence Richard had repainted 3 summers ago because the old paint was beginning to peel and he couldn't stand the sight of a thing he'd built declining without intervention. Come to dinner, she said. The silence this time was different. shorter and surprised, and carrying underneath it something that she suspected did not surface in this man very often. "I'm not a dinner kind of person," he said. "That's not an answer." "Evelyn, you sat outside my house all night," she said. "In the cold. You drove 40 miles to make sure nobody frightened me in the dark. The least I can do is feed you something that isn't diner eggs." She paused. "I'm making Richard's pot roast recipe. He got it from his mother, and she got it from hers, and it is by objective measure the best thing you will eat in the state of California." A long pause. "Sunday," he said, "if we're still in the area." "Sunday," she agreed. She hung up and found Emma standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her with that particular expression, the one that was somehow simultaneously 8 years old and completely ancient. "Was that him?" Emma asked. "Yes." "Is he coming back?" "Sunday," Evelyn said, "for dinner." Emma processed this with great seriousness and then said, "I'm going to make the pie," and walked back into the kitchen with the decisive energy of someone who has identified their contribution to a situation and intends to execute it completely. 3 days later, Martin Trevino sat across from Sandra Gao in a federal building in Los Angeles and surrendered the original documents he had taken from the Kern County Recorder's Office, 47 pages of deed transfer records, loan processing notes, and internal communications between Victor Doss and the attorney who managed Cascade Valley's portfolio through proper chain of custody, officially logged admissible and devastating. Gao had spent those 3 days building a case that she told her supervising agent was cleaner than anything she'd worked in 6 years because the fraud was so systematic and the fraudsters had been so confident of their protection that they had not even bothered to be subtle. The paper trail was direct. The evidence was overwhelming. The witness was credible and the documentation was original. Victor Doss was formally charged on a Thursday morning. 8 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of deed fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of obstruction. His attorney made a statement to the local press that used the word misunderstanding twice, which the local press then used as the first line of a story that ran in the Bakersfield Californian, under the headline, "County Loan Officer Charged in Federal Fraud Scheme, Multiple Elderly Victims Identified." Evelyn read the article at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was still hot this time, and she read it twice and then she put it down and sat with it for a while. The article mentioned her name, it mentioned Richard's name, it mentioned the auto shop. She had not expected that part the auto shop mentioned in a paragraph about Richard building something from nothing, about what it meant to lose not just a house, but the record of a life lived in it. She called her daughter in Sacramento, who had already seen the article, and answered the phone crying. "Mom," her daughter said. "Mom, are you okay? Are you—" "I'm fine," Evelyn said. "I'm in my kitchen, in my house." Her daughter cried harder, which was, Evelyn thought, completely appropriate. Sunday came. Evelyn had spent Saturday preparing with the focused seriousness of a woman who takes the feeding of guests as a matter of personal honor. The pot roast went in early. Richard's mother's recipe called for a low oven and patience, which Richard had always said was a metaphor for something, though he never specified what. Emma made the pie. She made it from scratch, apples from the bag in the refrigerator. Cinnamon and nutmeg measured with the precision of a scientist, the crust crimped along the edge with a fork, the way Evelyn had shown her twice, and Emma had watched with the intensity of someone committing a technique to permanent memory. Tommy set the table. He did it wrong twice and right the third time, and looked enormously pleased with himself. At 2 in the afternoon, a single motorcycle came down the street. Emma heard it first and was at the front window before the engine had stopped. "He's here," she announced unnecessarily since Evelyn had also heard it. Hollis knocked. Emma opened the door before Evelyn had crossed the living room, and for a moment the two of them stood regarding each other, the 62-year-old man who commanded rooms by existing in them, and the 8-year-old girl who had decided he was on their side in the first minute and had not reconsidered. "You came back," Emma said. "I said I would. Adults say things they don't mean sometimes." "I know," he said. "I meant it." Emma stepped back from the door with the air of someone extending a formal welcome, and Hollis came inside and the house closed around him, the way houses do when something that has been missing arrives. Rope came too. Evelyn had extended the invitation to include whoever Hollis wanted to bring, and Hollis had brought one person, which surprised her less than it might have 3 days ago. Rope was quieter at the dinner table than he'd been in the diner, which was a different kind of quiet, not alert professional, but genuinely at ease. relaxed in the way of someone who has been inside very few truly peaceful spaces recently. They ate. The pot roast was, as Evelyn had promised, extraordinary. Tommy ate 2 helpings and asked if he could have a third, and Evelyn said yes, and Hollis watched the boy with an expression that Rope would later describe to Davis as the expression of a man who remembers being hungry. Emma served the pie herself, carrying each plate with the concentration of a relay runner, holding a baton. "I made it," she told Hollis when she set his plate down. "From scratch," he said. "From scratch," she confirmed. "Grandma showed me how to do the crust." He looked at the pie. He took a bite. He looked at Emma. "This is good," he said with a directness that carried no performance in it, just the simple delivery of a fact. Emma beamed with the entirety of herself, the way children beam when they have been told something true by someone who does not say things he doesn't mean. After dinner, Evelyn and Hollis sat on the porch while Rope and Tommy played some card game that Tommy had invented the rules for on the spot and kept revising whenever he was losing. Emma was inside with the particular focused busyness of a child who has appointed herself in charge of kitchen cleanup. The porch light was on. It was always on. "When connected with the Sacramento Advocacy Group," Hollis said, "she told me. She said the woman who runs it called within an hour of you making the introduction." Evelyn wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "She said the other families, 2 of them, have already been contacted. They didn't know there were others. They thought they were alone in it." "People always think they're alone in it," Hollis said. "That's by design. Isolation is part of how the scheme works. You isolate each victim, make them feel like their specific situation is unique and hopeless, and they never compare notes and they never organize. Until someone makes them." "Until someone makes them," he agreed, so. Evelyn looked at the garden, at the roses along the back fence that would come back in spring without being asked. "What happens to you now?" she said. "You and your crew. Where do you go from here?" "East for a while," he said. "We've got things in New Mexico. Rope's family." He looked at her sideways, not quite surprised, but almost. "His mother," he said. "She's been sick. We've been putting it off." "Don't put it off," Evelyn said, with the simple authority of a woman who has learned exactly which things should not be put off. "Go see his mother." He nodded once. The street was quiet. A car went past and didn't slow. Somewhere the bonk that always barked at night began and then reconsidered. "I want to ask you something," Evelyn said, "and I want you to actually answer it, not give me the version of the answer that ends the conversation." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" she said. "Not the situation, not what happened here. You all right?" The silence this time was different from any of his silences she'd encountered before. It was not calculating. It was not considering what to share. It was the silence of someone who has been asked a direct question they were not prepared for and is sitting with the unexpected weight of it. "Most days," he said finally. "Some days more than others." "That's honest. You asked for honest." She looked at him, at the scar along his jaw, pale and old, at the hands that had given a stranger his phone number on a blank card and then sat in the cold all night making sure the stranger was safe. At the face of a man who had built something from broken pieces and was still, she thought, occasionally surprised that it held. "Richard used to say," she said quietly, "that the difference between a good man and a man who does good things is about 60% smaller than most people think." She paused. "I think he was right." Hollis said nothing, but he didn't look away. "Come back," she said. "If you're ever in this part of California again, come to dinner. Emma will make pie." "She'll get better at the crust," he said. "She's already good at the crust." "She's good for 8, he said. "She'll be great at 20. Evelyn smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that hadn't come easily in 14 months and came now without effort, the way the roses came back every spring. Natural, faithful, sure of itself. Inside the house, she could hear Emma clattering through the kitchen cleanup with tremendous confidence, and Tommy laughing at something Rope had done with the hose and the ordinary, irreplaceable music of a house that is alive. Hollis left at 7. Rope shook Evelyn's hand at the door with both of his, a gesture so unexpectedly formal and sincere that she felt it in her chest. And Tommy extracted a solemn promise that Rope would teach him the real rules of the car game next time. And Emma stood at the door and watched Hollis walk to his motorcycle with the serene attention of someone seeing something she will remember. At the motorcycle, he turned back. He looked at the house, at the porch light, at the mailbox with Carter impatient letters at Evelyn, standing in the doorway with her grandchildren pressed against her on either side. He raised one hand. Not a wave exactly. An acknowledgement. A recognition. Evelyn raised hers in return. He started the engine. The sound filled the street, and then the street released it, the way streets release things that were never meant to stay. And the motorcycle moved away from the curb and down the block and around the corner. And the sound faded by degrees until there was nothing left of it but the ordinary quiet of an evening, in a neighborhood where people were home and lights were on, and the world was for this moment doing what it was supposed to do. Evelyn stood in her doorway for a moment longer than necessary. Emma on her left and Tommy on her right, the porch light burning steadily above them all. Then she brought her grandchildren inside and locked the door and went to make sure the kitchen was properly done. And tomorrow came the way tomorrow always comes, without asking, without explaining, without promises about what it contains. And in it, Evelyn Carter was in her house, and the house had her name on it, and that name was not going anywhere. Some debts are too old to trace back to their origin. Some kindnesses move through the world without signatures passed from stranger to stranger across decades and highways, and the long, ordinary distances between people who will never know each other's names. A woman in Arizona puts down a bag without looking back. A man rides toward a forgotten highway decades later and stops for coffee at a diner he has never visited. A widow asks a question she is ashamed of, and a room goes silent, and something that was broken begins slowly and then all at once to be repaired. That is how it works if you let it. That is how it has always worked. Not through systems, not through the machinery of institutions built by people who have forgotten what they were built for, but through the stubborn, costly, inconvenient decision of one person to turn toward another and say, I see what is happening to you, and I am not going to keep riding. Jack Mercer drove east into the dark and did not look back because that was not the kind of man he was, and because looking back was not what the moment required. The moment required exactly what it had received a man who stayed until it was done and then trusted the thing he'd built to hold. It held.